I did not sleep well last night. You may not have either. Woke up at maybe 1:30 and watched until 3:30 to see what happened. Pretty stunning victory for Donald Trump, the Republican Party. It looks like all seven swing states are going red. The Senate has gone Republican majority. It looks like the House may also. Um, the popular vote as well going to Donald Trump. Just an amazing moment politically. Um, Donald Trump is far from the man we want him to be. I think we need to pray for Trump and the Trump administration that they become more pro-life than they acted like they were going to be over the last 6 months. But this is still, I believe, a common grace mercy of God on our country. I'm not saying Trump is God's man. I'm not saying Trump is a Christian. He's not. I'm simply saying that he is going to restrain evil better than the opponent, Kamala Harris, in this situation. Let me mention some things that I think are worth mentioning. Quoting Lila Rose, who's a Catholic pro-life activist online, Kamala Harris used her power as California Attorney General to attempt to force pro-life pregnancy center nonprofits to post abortion advertisements in their clinics. So we have one in Athens, right? The Athens Pregnancy Center, which is wonderful. Our church gives money to them because they are doing wonderful work, literally saving babies' lives every year, many of them. Kamala Harris used her power as California Attorney General to force, or she was trying to force, attempted to force pro-life pregnancy centers to advertise abortion in their clinics. Lila Rose continues, Harris's campaign has also spread massive amounts of misinformation about abortion, claiming that miscarriage treatments are being banned in pro-life states. They are not. There was a lot of misinformation about what the pro-life movement's about, as if we won't treat ectopic pregnancies, as if we won't treat miscarriages, as if that is also banned when we're trying to ban abortion. That's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, but that is the misinformation that they were campaigning on. On September 23rd, Kamala Harris said, quote, I've been very clear. I think we should eliminate the filibuster for Roe and get us to the point where 51 votes would be what we need to actually put back in law the protections for reproductive freedom. So filibuster means you need to have 60 votes. I think it's been in place for 180 years. She wants to overturn the filibuster. Why? So that she can push through Roe as legislation with a 51 vote majority. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen. That's what I'm talking about. I'm saying this is what the Lord has mercifully spared us from last night. But when she says Roe, she doesn't actually mean Roe, because Roe had some flexibility when it came to the viability of an infant. And as technology advances, viability gets earlier. So, what is it, 20 weeks, 21 weeks, 22 weeks, babies can survive. They don't always, but they can survive. In 1973, it was later in the pregnancy. I don't know when, but the age has gotten earlier because of technology, which is a wonderful blessing. But she doesn't just mean Roe, because Roe allowed for flexibility at the state level after viability, I believe. So, especially third trimester, states could have different policies in place. But she wants not Roe. She wants something even more radical than Roe. She wanted, and she's not going to get, at least at this time, she wanted to allow abortion at any point in pregnancy for any reason, for all 9 months. The Lord is sparing us from that presidency. That's a mercy. Two weeks ago, about October 22nd, maybe a little more than 2 weeks, Kamala Harris was asked by an NBC reporter, you can look this up, quote, this is what the reporter says, what concessions would be on the table? What concessions regarding abortion would be on the table? Religious exemptions, for example, is that something you would consider? Kamala Harris, quote, I don't think we should be making exemptions when we're talking about a fundamental freedom to make decisions about your own body. So, to translate this, This means that she would force medical professionals, regardless of their religious beliefs, to perform abortions. This is unimaginable evil. Lila Rose, quote, "If she had the power and the ability, she would force healthcare professionals and hospitals to commit abortions or else lose their ability to practice medicine." Another Christian said, who was talking to Al Mohler, quote, "So religious freedom is not a fundamental right, but the right to kill an unborn child is." The Lord mercifully spared us from the presidency of that person. Now, let me be honest in my criticism of Donald Trump, J.D. Vance. Vance has said that he would support the abortion pill, which is responsible for upwards of 60% of abortions right now in our culture, in our country. That is a great evil to support that. What is it, mifepristone or whatever it's called? Donald Trump has flip-flopped on the abortion pill. Quoting one person, "On some occasions, the former president has said he would not restrict access to the pill. On others, that he would be open to federal restrictions." This is not okay. 60% of abortions right now are coming through these pills. These pills need to be stopped. They need to be banned. And the president and the vice president and everyone else should stand decidedly against it. Trump has also announced that he would support taxpayer-funded IVF. This is in vitro fertilization. Now, I'm not saying that I am an expert on IVF. I'm not also saying that IVF is inherently wrong or sinful. What I am saying, and I think this is objectively true, the way that IVF is normally practiced, the vast majority of the time, it is normally practiced, it results in microscopic human beings, these embryos or zygotes, and they are indefinitely frozen, and many of them will never be implanted in a woman's womb, and they will be eventually discarded. From what I understand, some of them are even worked on, not experimented upon. Trump has promised to fund this federally to help with this. These are extremely expensive. It could be $20,000 or $30,000 for a couple to go through the procedure and to end up with a child who is born. The problem with IVF is when you have sperm and egg meet, you fertilize the egg, you have the microscopic baby, the embryo, and if 15 embryos are formed, that's 15 human image bearers, microscopic, and some of them will be discarded for they don't look as good genetically or whatever the argument is, and some of them will be implanted into the mother's womb, some of them will be left forever out and will never be implanted. This results in essentially abortions of massive numbers of embryos. So IVF, as it is practiced, generally is very bad because you don't always implant the embryo. Frozen, destroyed, discarded, experimented upon. This is not acceptable. This could result in hundreds of thousands of microscopic image bearers of God being exterminated as medical waste, and Trump supports it. Shockingly, Ted Cruz is the one that was, I think, initiating this or helping bring this to the fore. This is not okay. Trump also criticized Florida's heartbeat law, saying 6 weeks is too short. He wants abortion maybe up to 15 weeks or something along those lines. Now, we must be fair. We've got to distinguish between his personal opinion and what he desires to legislate into law. To quote Michael Carlino from Christ Overall, which is a great website and podcast, quote, "While Trump may veto a national abortion ban, he will also veto any national abortion law Congress puts on his desk." So Trump will veto a national abortion ban. That is sin on his part. He should sign a national abortion ban. This idea of, I'm going to leave it at the state level, you would never say that about the African slave trade. Just leave it, just let the states vote on it. No one would, could, or should ever say that. That is not an acceptable position to say, well, let's just vote on something that's morally abhorrent. But Trump says, I'm going to leave it at the state level. If we're talking about killing unborn children in the womb, that should not be left to the states. That should be made illegal, federally banned. Trump is wrong on this. And Christians who voted for him, should say so. But the good news is he will also not sign a federal abortion law. Kamala Harris said that she will sign federal abortion law. She's salivating to do so. It's a mercy that she did not win, but Trump needs to do better than he has said he will do on this issue. He must. Lila Rose said she was able to spend 2 hours with Trump arguing passionately for the unborn, and Trump at least listened. He at least gave her a seat at the table. That is not something a Kamala Harris administration would have done. So I'm thankful that Trump will listen to her, but he needs to act in accordance with consistently pro-life convictions, and that is not something that he has done as we would wish. Let me speak here a little bit more encouraging on the transgender issue. Again, start negative. This is what we were saved from. Newsweek says of Tim Walz, VP under Kamala, at least that's what he was running for. In April of 2023, this is what Newsweek says, Walz signed a Minnesota law aimed at protecting the rights of the LGBTQ plus community to access and receive gender-affirming health care, which may include a range of medical procedures and care such as surgery and puberty blockers. It also states that if a child has been abandoned or their safety is at risk or they are unable to obtain gender-affirming care, the court of this state has temporary emergency jurisdiction. So what he's saying is the law used to say that if a child's being beaten or abused or something along those lines, of course the state can step in and help preserve the child's life and safety. But they've added a new reason why the state can step in and obtain, quote, temporary emergency jurisdiction. So number one, the child's been abandoned. That makes sense. Number two, their safety's at risk. That makes sense. Number three, this is what Tim Walz added, or they are unable to obtain gender-affirming care. Let me read directly from the bill. Quote, this is called temporary emergency jurisdiction. It says this, point A, a court of this state has temporary emergency jurisdiction if the child is present in this state and the child has been unable to obtain gender-affirming health care. This is unbelievably wicked. In other words, if Christian parents or any parents have a daughter who thinks she's a boy and she's 14 and she wants to obtain gender-affirming care and the parents won't let her, the state can step in and say that's child abuse on the same level as physically beating your child, and we're going to take your child away and we are going to make sure the child can get the care the child needs. This is not politics. This is profoundly basic moral issues. These are. One Christian writer at World Opinions says, quote, this is a draconian measure that undermines parental authority. In Minnesota, refusing to provide puberty blockers and genital mutilation is now the legal equivalent of physically abusing a child. It is now grounds for the state to take emergency custody of children. The Lord mercifully spared us from that man being vice president. The 2024 Republican platform is generally good here. The Republican platform on this point says, quote, Republicans will end left-wing gender insanity. We will keep men out of women's sports, ban taxpayer funding for sex change surgeries, and stop taxpayer-funded schools from promoting gender transition, and restore protections for women and girls, end quote. That's a generally good statement. It does not go far enough because they do not oppose same-sex marriage. They do not oppose no-fault divorce. These would be more consistently Christian positions, but they at least get that part about transgenderism generally correct, and I am thankful for that. I hope that they become even more consistent from a biblical perspective than even they state there, and that's something we should pray for. Let me also mention the Equality Act. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this piece of legislation. It has not passed. Let me quote Andrew Walker, who's an ethics professor at Southern Seminary. I really like Andrew Walker. He's got the Bully Pulpit podcast, which I recommend. Quote, Andrew Walker says, the bill represents, the Equality Act, represents the most invasive threat to religious liberty ever proposed in America. It communicates that Christian beliefs about what it means to be male and female and how marriage ought to be defined are incompatible with what U.S. law considers to be decent, reasonable, goodwill convictions. Virtually no area of American life would emerge unscathed from the Equality Act's reach. No less significant would be the long-term effects of how the law would shape the moral imagination of future generations, end quote. Al Mohler agrees, quote, the legislation known as the Equality Act represents the greatest present threat to religious liberty in the United States. In many ways, as legislation, it represents the greatest threat to religious liberty in the United States in our lifetimes. The Equality Act, as it is packaged, died in the Senate in the last Congress because it had a Republican majority that refused to move forward. So you see here again, the Equality Act wants to squelch religious liberty. For us to be able to say what we believe about gender and sexuality would be considered illegal in many ways. And this would affect colleges, it would affect all kinds of things. Who is hired? Those kinds of things. Mohler continues, it will be very, very difficult for any Christian college or university to operate in Christian conviction. It will be very, very difficult for any Christian ministry that's not defined as a local church to actually uphold any historic Christian doctrine. NPR, National Public Radio, says about, they quote then Representative David Cicilline, I think is his name. He was a Democratic representative from Rhode Island. He's an openly gay legislator and the lead Equality Act sponsor in the House. Let me quote David Cicilline. Quote, the determination would have to be made as to whether or not the decisions they are making are connected to their religious teachings and to their core function as a religious organization, or is it a pretext to discrimination? And then NPR adds, such a determination would presumably be made by the courts. In other words, the government will determine whether or not Christian institutions are acting from biblical principle or out of simple discrimination. In other words, the government will determine what the Bible says. Al Mohler comments about this, quote, the government will determine if your hiring and housing and student conduct and employee policies are truly connected to your religious teachings, or if you are merely using a claim of religious conviction as a pretext to discriminate. These words mean the effective death of religious liberty, for the burden of proof will now fall to each religious institution to prove to the government's satisfaction that its convictions are authentic. The official 2024 Democratic Party platform says, quote, that's why Democrats will pass the Equality Act. The Republican Party is not for the Equality Act. They stopped it already in Congress, but the Democrat Party put in their platform that they will pass it. The greatest threat to religious liberty in our lifetime, as Al Mohler and Andrew Walker call it. Here's what the 2024 Republican platform says. Again, not perfect. It falls short of God's standard, but here's what it says. Quote, Republicans will defend religious liberty. We are the defenders of the First Amendment right to religious liberty. It protects the right not only to worship according to the dictates of conscience, but also to act in accordance with those beliefs, not just in places of worship, but in everyday life. To protect religious liberty, Republicans support a new federal task force on fighting anti-Christian bias that will investigate all forms of illegal discrimination, harassment, and persecution against Christians in America, end quote. Wow. That's pretty strong. Not perfect, but that is pretty strong. Let me mention about Kamala Harris. According to FirstLiberty.org, Harris was an original co-sponsor of the Equality Act. That's no surprise. On June 22nd of last year, Kamala Harris tweeted, quote, yesterday, the Equality Act was reintroduced in Congress. The House and Senate must pass this long overdue legislation to guarantee every LGBTQI plus American the right to live freely and openly, end quote. On her website, KamalaHarris.org, just a week or two ago, this is what it says, probably still there. Quote, in 2004, Kamala Harris, officiated some of the nation's first same-sex marriages. In 2004, 20 years ago, Kamala Harris officiated some of the nation's first, quote, same-sex marriages. As president, she will fight to pass the Equality Act and enshrine anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQI plus Americans in healthcare, housing, education, and more into law. The Lord mercifully spared us that nonsense, that horrific stuff. NBC News writes, quote, this is NBC, quote, President Donald Trump opposes the passage of the Equality Act. A senior administration official confirmed the president's opposition. Quote, this bill in its current form is filled with poison pills that threaten to undermine parental and conscience rights. I am thankful that that is the conviction of the man who just won the presidency. Now, In the bad news, the 2016 Republican platform said, quote, traditional marriage and family based on marriage between one man and one woman is the foundation for a free society, end quote. So they upheld traditional marriage. 2016, 2020, they repeated, I think, the same platform without, I don't think any changes were made. But sadly, and this was led by Donald Trump and his people, the 2024 Republican platform removed this statement from the platform. They removed the statement of marriage being between a man and a woman. They now just speak of respecting marriage, but it's not defined anymore. That is not okay. That is not a move in a good direction. That opens the door to all the, quote, same-sex marriage, the so-called same-sex marriage, and it seems to legitimate those things. That is not good. The Republican Party needs to come back and reinforce traditional marriage between a man and a woman as the only definition of true marriage. So again, in our current situation, the Democrat Party is not a party Christians can vote for. When it comes to protecting life, they want to kill as many babies as they possibly can through abortion, it seems, all the way up till birth. They want to oppose religious liberty. LGBTQ, quote, rights trump religious freedom and rights. They want to use government funding to take children away from their homes, at least that's what Tim Walz legislated in Minnesota, so that the government can pay for gender mutilation in surgeries. So they oppose protecting innocent life. They oppose biblical marriage, natural law understanding of marriage as a procreative act between a man and a woman. They are for transgenderism, against religious liberty, for the Equality Act. I mean, this administration was horrific in many ways, objectively, from a biblical perspective. Stephen Wellum, professor at Southern Seminary, says this, quote, Christians must stand for what is right, but we must also not think that our salvation comes from political leaders. Let me lay my cards on the table. I cannot vote for the Democrat Party, given that they stand for the destruction of human life, marriage, the family, wealth, and basically all things biblical. Let's be honest. A party that rejects God's natural/moral law is determined to destroy everything in society, and I cannot vote for that. In my view, the Democrat Party is not an option for Christians. But what about the Republicans? As we think about political parties, we must first stand as Christians, not as partisans. Amen to that, Stephen Wellum. We are not fundamentally committed to a political party. We need to be able to call all sin out everywhere we see it because we're nonpartisan. That doesn't mean we don't vote. It means that we don't vote with unfiltered, total acceptance and embrace of anything the politician that we might have voted for says. Let me continue the quote. Quote, as a Christian, Wellum writes, as I evaluate the GOP, I think it's a disaster. The Republican Party, he's saying, is a disaster. Yet, there is still within it a direction that is not as anti-human as the Democrat Party. Further, the GOP still allows conservative Christians to influence their party. So unless we're going to start another party, which presently is not viable, we have a binary choice. We have a two-party choice. To sit out is not a responsible option since we lose the influence of our voice entirely. That's Wellum's take on it. Joe Rigney says this, quote, if you are a Christian who has been vocally never Trump, if you're a Christian who's been vocally never Trump, are you equally vocal about being never Democrat? Given that they are the party of Romans 1, giving hearty approval to all manner of idolatry, sexual deviancy, envy, murder, and other evils. Andrew David Naselli, who worked with John Piper, he was an elder at Piper's church, now he's planting another church. He also has been working with Don Carson for years. Andrew Naselli writes, quote, I think this is a helpful statement, quote, given the Democratic Party's platform, I don't think voting for a Democratic candidate is a faithful option for a Christian. 3 options remain for the Christian. He gives the 3 main options for the Christian. These are his words entirely. Quote, number 1, vote for a Republican candidate. Number 2, vote for a third-party candidate. Then he adds a parenthesis, I personally think this is wasting your vote, in parenthesis. Then number 3, don't vote. Then he adds parenthesis, I personally think this is irresponsible, end parenthesis, end quote. Let me also mention here something from Kevin DeYoung. Compromise may be deadly in theology, but it's part and parcel of politics. This is, by the way, he wrote this in 2012. This is not from this election. As we ponder the perfect president and imagine the wonderful policies we would put in place, we have to plant our feet firmly on the ground and determine how to best accomplish what we want with our one vote. Prudence is no enemy of principle, and incrementalism does not mean death to our ideals. In other words, taking steps toward the ideal is not necessarily wrong. That's sometimes how you have to play. It's like a football game. You can't score a touchdown every time you throw the ball. You have to make steps. You have to move progressively down the field. Incrementalism, moving towards the ideal, the biblical ideal. He continues, quote, "There is no reason our consciences should be stricken by voting for imperfect parties and imperfect candidates. We are not voting for a new clause to the Nicene Creed. We are determining who will make our laws, defend them, and carry them out. This choice will almost always require Christians to weigh bad against better and do without what is best." So, I don't think it is wrong to be grateful to the Lord for the mercy of what happened yesterday. I mean that. But a Trump victory does not. A Trump victory simply staged the tide of evil for 4 more years, a little bit more. But we need, now that the Republican Party may have the House and the Senate and the White House, they need to become more pro-life than they have said that they will be. They need to become more for biblical marriage than they have recently said that they will be. They need to be more against transgenderism and all these. They need to move toward these things and accept religious freedom and liberty. We need to pray to that end, that Trump will be a much more pro-life president than he is saying he will be the last 6 months. That legislation will be passed, that abortion will be minimized and eventually banned in our country. That's what we want. It was great to see in Florida, Amendment 4 failed. Amendment 4 wanted to allow abortion because Ron DeSantis essentially had the heartbeat bill 6 weeks. And the Amendment 4 was saying, let's allow abortion pretty much through birth with all kinds of restrictions removed. And thank the Lord, that did not pass. That will save thousands of children's lives in Florida, I would assume, over the next few years. Praise the Lord for that grace. That's one of the few pro-life wins at the state level since the overturning of Roe in June of 2022. We need to pray for a lot more of these things. We need to pray that our country would turn to the Lord, that our country would turn away from worshiping sex and baby killing as birth control and all these kind of horrific deviancies, that we would return to Scripture, Jesus, the gospel, proclamation of Christ and Him crucified, that people would be converted by the hundreds of thousands, that the culture would change, that God would do a great and mighty saving work. Trump is not going to rein in. He's not going to bring in the gospel. He's not going to bring in that. That's not what he's going to do. We hope he stays the tide of evil and brings in more just and biblically sound laws to protect life and religious liberty and to overturn the LGBTQ nonsense that is hurting and damaging and destroying lives across our country and across our culture right now. Absolutely. But we need to pray that the church rises up and that God uses this time to bring a great victory for the gospel in this time. So thank you for listening to my thoughts. Some rambling there. But we can be thankful to God, but there is still a massive fight ahead of us. Thank you for watching.